The wind moans through the jagged ridges of the Cantabrian mountains, carrying with it the smell of pine, damp stone, and something older, something forgotten. Night settles unevenly over Asturias, where valleys sink into shadow faster than the peaks surrender their final touches of dying light. In the ruins of a crumbling monastery perched above the Nalon River, time itself seems reluctant to move forward, as though the air clings to secrets buried deep within its walls. Here, among fractured pillars and vine-choked cloisters, a tattered monk's journal was found just decades ago, its pages half consumed by mold, the ink faded like whispers caught between centuries. It tells of two boys, princes of Asturias, whose laughter once echoed through these halls and whose names were spoken with reverence. Then, one summer night, they simply vanished, and no one ever spoke of them again. You probably won't sleep soundly after this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I like knowing who's keeping me company in these late-night wanderings. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The journal begins with a chilling line. They warned us not to pray too loudly, for the dead may be listening. It doesn't say who they were, or why the monks were afraid, but it sets the tone for everything that follows. According to these fragile, water-stained pages, the princes had been sent here for protection, not punishment, not exile, protection, which, naturally, raises the question, from whom? In 14th century Asturias, protection was an expensive, fragile luxury, while the region's rugged mountains offered natural defenses. They also bred isolation and paranoia. Rival noble houses, Velasquez, Quiñones, Navias, jostled constantly for favor with the crown. Marriage alliances were brokered like business deals, and daggers often whispered louder than words. Into this world came two young heirs, celebrated as the kingdom's future yet unwittingly trapped within its oldest, deadliest game, succession. The journal claims the monastery was chosen precisely because of its remoteness. They would be safe here, it insists, where stone and prayer could keep evil at bay. But even the thickest walls cannot bar ambition. And then, there's this small, maddening detail. According to property records unearthed centuries later, a secret passage ran from beneath the monastery's crypt straight into the wooded ravines below. No mention of this exists in royal decrees. But the monks must have known. Someone always knows. Historians still argue whether the princes were sent here willingly or spirited away under the cover of night. Some believe their father, the reigning king, trusted no one, not even his own court, and wanted them hidden until they came of age. Others suspect he feared rebellion, perhaps even from within his own bloodline. The crown was never just a symbol of unity, it was a battlefield made of velvet and iron. It's strange how quickly joy can curdle into dread. The journal notes that the prince's days were filled with study, prayer, and, oddly, silences. Servants reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors, muffled voices behind locked doors, and once, a scream so sudden it froze every monk in his tracks. But when they searched, they found nothing, or at least, that's what they said. There's an entry dated midsummer, just days before the disappearance. The elder dreams of rivers red and eyes in the dark, the younger prays to forget. No further explanation. Was this the rambling of an overwrought scribe? Or a veiled warning that something was already unraveling? Here's the part that keeps scholars awake at night. No official records exist confirming the prince's deaths. None. No funeral rites. No royal decrees of mourning. Nothing but silence, so deep and deliberate it feels almost louder than confession. In a kingdom obsessed with lineage, where even minor cousins had their births and deaths recorded with painstaking care. This absence is more than suspicious, it's damning. And then there's the final fragment from the journal, written in a shaky, hurried hand. The bells did not toll. We dared not look. After that, the pages stop. If you stand in the ruins today, where moss swallows stone and ivy knots itself into what once were windows, you can almost hear the echoes of unanswered questions. Who, or what, came for the princes that night? Were they hidden, killed, saved, or did they slip away willingly? Abandoning crown and kin for reasons we still can't fathom? There's one last unsettling twist to this opening chapter. Among the monastery's rubble, archaeologists also uncovered something else. A child's carved wooden horse. Broken clean down the middle. Its painted eyes scraped away. Coincidence? They said. Maybe, but maybe not. Mist curls over the narrow cobblestone streets of Oviedo, wrapping the ancient city in a damp, uneasy hush. The scent of wood smoke mingles with sea air drifting inland from the Bay of Biscay. Carrying whispers of a kingdom on the edge, Asturias in the late 14th century is not the quiet, green refuge the modern eye imagines. It is a land fracturing beneath the weight of ambition. And, as always, power has a habit of sharpening its knives long before anyone realizes they're bleeding. At this time, the Kingdom of Castile stretches across much of northern Spain, with Asturias forming one of its most fiercely independent regions. It is mountainous, defiant, and stubbornly loyal to its own customs. To hold Asturias is to control a gateway to the Cantabrian Sea, a strategic prize coveted by rival lords and foreign crowns alike. But within these jagged valleys, allegiance is as slippery as river stones. Noble families shift loyalty like shadows in torchlight, offering smiles in public and daggers in private. Royal records from this period describe a court, alive with ceremony yet hollowed by mistrust. The king, Sancho IV, nicknamed El Bravo, the Brave, had united his kingdom through war but failed to unite his bloodline. His untimely death left a fragile succession, 2 young princes, beloved by the common people yet surrounded by a court that resembled a chessboard where every bishop, knight, and rook plotted independently. One of those bishops was Count Nuño de Guzman, a man known for his honeyed words and unusually well-fed hunting falcons. Chronicles describe him as smiling always, but never with his eyes, which, let's be honest, is never a good sign in medieval politics. The Guzmans were not alone. The Velasquez, fierce warlords of the western passes, believed their blood purer than the royal line itself. The Quiñones clan, meanwhile, controlled the wealthiest iron mines in the north and, according to one scandalous account, kept a private army of mercenaries hidden in monasteries. If that sounds extreme, welcome to Asturias in the 1300s. Historians still argue whether the seeds of the prince's disappearance were planted here. Amid this tangled web of competing loyalties, some scholars believe the danger came from outside, powerful foreign factions like Aragon or even England, eager to destabilize Castile by removing its heirs. Others, more cynically, suggest the threat was entirely homegrown. Why look to foreign assassins when your own uncles want your throne? And yet, it's not just human ambition that clouds the story. There's a peculiar quirk buried in the chronicles of the time, several references to a curse of the bloodline. These aren't dusty superstitions scribbled in the margins, they appear in official court documents, suggesting that even the crown itself feared some ancient doom. One royal proclamation warns against allowing the heirs to dwell where the river bends beneath the shadowed hills. Guess where the monastery where they vanished just happened to sit? Right at the bend of the Nalon River. Beneath, you guessed it, the shadowed hills. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe someone in power deliberately sent them to a place whispered about for generations. Meanwhile, the people of Asturias had their own interpretations. Folklore from this period is thick with ominous portents. Black hounds seen prowling palace gates. Bells ringing at midnight without a hand to pull the rope. And, my personal favorite, an account of 2 pale-faced children walking barefoot across the river at dawn. Were these supposed to be the princes? Ghostly doppelgangers? Or just a poetic flourish from a medieval storyteller trying to sell more parchment? We'll never know. But someone clearly wanted the world to think strange forces were at play. Yet beneath the fog and whispers, one thing is undeniable. The princes were already pawns in a political storm before they could even understand the rules. Royal tutors reported how every lesson in mathematics or Latin somehow circled back to loyalty, loyalty to the crown, loyalty to the blood, loyalty to the idea of a unified Castile. It sounds noble until you remember that half the men giving these lectures were secretly conspiring to tear that unity apart. Here's where things get truly unsettling. Surviving tax ledgers from the decade reveal something odd. Lavish sums spent on provisions for the royal heirs, vanish from the records entirely 1 year before their disappearance. Instead, the funds are redirected to securing sanctified grounds. Historians still argue whether this referred to fortifying the monastery or preparing something far darker. And then there's the rumor, persistent, slippery, impossible to prove, that the king himself signed a secret decree declaring one of his sons illegitimate. If true, it would have split loyalties violently, perhaps even fatally. Imagine being a boy of 12 and learning half the court sees you as the rightful heir while the other half whispers that you're nothing more than a pawn to discard. It's enough to make anyone disappear, one way or another. Asturias, with its mist-wrapped mountains and rebel heart, became the stage for this slow-building tragedy. Behind velvet curtains, alliances shifted, letters passed hands in coded phrases about falcons released and wolves fed. One minor lord, whose diary survives in fragments, claimed he attended a private council where it was decided the princes would never sit upon the throne. Whether that meant they'd be hidden or silenced, the pages don't say. If you walk Oviedo's old quarter today, past the sandstone arches of the Cathedral of San Salvador, it's easy to forget this was once the nerve center of a kingdom fraying at its edges. But some locals still swear that on certain fog-heavy nights, you can hear children's laughter drifting from beneath the cobbles, faint and broken, like echoes struggling to escape. And while folklore can be misleading, I'll leave you with this thought: the deeper we dig into the political chaos of Asturias, the more it feels as though the prince's fate was sealed long before that summer night. Because here's the quiet horror no one wants to say aloud: sometimes the trap is set years before the prey even knows it exists. The air inside the royal palace of Oviedo smells of beeswax and rosemary, the usual perfume of power in 14th century Asturias. Yet beneath the polished veneer of tapestries and gilded icons, unease curls like smoke through the corridors. 2 births should have brought peace, celebration, even, but instead, they sowed the first seeds of a mystery that centuries still cannot unravel. The princes of Asturias were born beneath the shadow of an unsteady throne. The elder, Prince Fernando, arrived in the winter of 1385, during a snowstorm so violent that chroniclers wrote, "The heavens split in protest." His younger brother, Prince Rodrigo, followed 2 years later, his first cries rising beneath an eclipse that cloaked the city in a sudden and unnatural twilight. A charming start, really, if you're writing a ghost story. To the people of Asturias, these celestial signs were ominous. The court astrologer recorded that 2 stars fell into the sea the night Fernando drew breath, which everyone agreed was either profoundly symbolic or catastrophically bad luck. Rodrigo's eclipse? Even worse. Some whispered he had been born under shadow, a poetic way of suggesting fate itself had marked him. Historians still argue whether these omens were exaggerated later, layered onto the story after the prince's disappearance, or genuinely feared at the time. Either way, the records are full of peculiar details surrounding their early lives, strange dreams, whispered prophecies, and an unusual obsession with secrecy. For example, a midwife's personal notes, rediscovered in the archives centuries later, describe how Fernando's birth was attended by an unusually large guard detail. 12 armed men stood watch outside the queen's chambers, a number far beyond tradition. Even stranger, she notes that after cutting the umbilical cord, a royal advisor ordered the remnants burned immediately. Burned. That wasn't normal then. It isn't normal now. One theory suggests fear of witchcraft, magic, after all, still slithered through the edges of court belief. Others argue the burning was symbolic, a way of severing ties between the infant and any claims of divine right. A few conspiratorial voices go further, hinting at an unrecorded scandal within the bloodline, something the court wanted erased before it could grow roots. Despite these early shadows, childhood at the Oviedo Palace seemed, at least outwardly, idyllic. Accounts describe Fernando as quiet and contemplative, with an unusual fascination for maps. Rodrigo, by contrast, was lively, quick-witted, and constantly in trouble, a boy more likely to scale a tapestry than memorize his Latin declensions. One scribe noted, "The elder reads kingdoms in parchment, the younger finds them in trees." Behind these charming anecdotes, however, danger pressed ever closer. By the time Fernando turned 7, noble factions were already angling for control of the boy's education. Which tutor they studied under mattered, not just for lessons in language or history, but for shaping loyalty. The Velasquez sponsored a renowned jurist, hoping to anchor the princes in legal precedents favoring their interests. The Guzmans preferred a firebrand theologian, one notorious for questioning the legitimacy of distant royal cousins. Guess which tutor mysteriously fell ill before he could begin his lessons? Rodrigo's birth under an eclipse also followed him like a quiet curse. Servants whispered that shadows in his chambers stretched longer than they should, or that the candles near his bed burned lower than anywhere else in the palace. One nurse even claimed she found tiny footprints in ash along the nursery floor one morning. Though no one else believed her, or at least, no one admitted to believing her. Folklore entwines itself with fact here, and it's difficult to know where history ends and myth begins. Some later legends claim that Rodrigo often spoke to a pale man without a name, who came to him in dreams. Convenient embellishment? Probably, but paired with the prophecies already hanging over the boys, it's easy to see how such whispers hardened into superstition over time. There's one recorded moment that historians cannot agree on: the Feast of St. Matthew. When the princes were paraded before the people of Oviedo for the first time, witnesses described cheering crowds and bells ringing across the city. But tucked within a single surviving manuscript is an unsettling line. 2 doves loosed from their cages circled thrice and fell dead before reaching the gate. Some interpret this as symbolism added later. Others argue the chronicler recorded an actual event. If true, it's one of those details that gnaws at the back of your mind, the kind of coincidence you desperately want to dismiss but somehow can't. By the time Fernando turned 10, the brothers' paths had already diverged. Fernando was groomed as the rightful heir, his lessons steeped in governance and diplomacy. Rodrigo, however, was increasingly drawn away from court life. A letter from their mother hints at her unease. The younger boy walks often in shadowed gardens, seeking corners where none may follow. Was it just the restless nature of a second son, destined for a quieter life? Or did Rodrigo sense, even then, that something darker loomed over both their fates? One more curiosity. During restoration work at the palace in the 18th century, workers uncovered a sealed compartment behind the nursery's hearth. Inside were 2 objects: a small silver medallion engraved with the royal crest, and a child's leather shoe, preserved almost perfectly by centuries of soot. The medallion matched artifacts confirmed to belong to the princes. The shoe? Far too small for either of them. No records exist explaining why it was hidden there, or whose foot once wore it. Looking back, it's hard not to feel that everything about their early years was preparing us for tragedy. The omens, the whispers, the strange silences, they stack up like stones in a cairn, marking a path that leads straight to their disappearance. And maybe, just maybe, someone in that palace already knew how the story would end. Because here's the thing about history's deepest mysteries: sometimes, the ghosts start haunting the living long before they die. The sound of ringing steel echoes faintly through the marble halls of the Oviedo Palace, practice swords clashing somewhere in the courtyards below. It is training day for the royal guard. But to anyone listening closely, it sounds less like preparation and more like warning. Asturias in the final years of the 14th century is a kingdom balancing on a blade's edge. And everyone knows it. Outside the palace walls, banners of rival houses whip in the northern wind. Inside, polished smiles conceal sharpened intentions. The princes, now approaching adolescence, are still too young to understand the rules of this dangerous game. But the court around them vibrates with paranoia. Theirs is a world where dinner conversations double as strategy meetings, where gifts hide threats, and where alliances are written in ink that always seems one betrayal away from vanishing. At the center of the storm stands Count Nuño de Guzman, master of whispers, dealer of secrets, and patron saint of smug expressions. Surviving letters describe him as amiable in company, venomous in counsel. He speaks softly, but every word is a trap laid for someone else. Across from him, politically and sometimes literally, stands Doña Inés de Velasco, matriarch of one of Asturias's oldest houses. Where Guzman prefers manipulation, Ines wields blunt force, her soldiers guard the western passes. And her coffers, swollen by mining wealth, make her one of the most powerful figures in the north. Chroniclers note she once threw a goblet at Guzman's head during a royal dinner. Which may be the most relatable anyone in this story has ever been. And hovering above them both, like a chess player staring at an increasingly chaotic board, is King Henry III, young, ambitious, and already suspicious of everyone at his table. Historians still argue whether the king was genuinely trying to protect his sons or simply buying time to secure his throne. One thing is clear: the court became a hive of secret pacts. Late-night meetings behind shuttered doors, coded letters ferried by trusted servants, and an endless exchange of favors no one ever spoke about openly. One such letter, discovered centuries later in the archives of Leon, contains a single chilling sentence: "The hawks must not fly before winter." We don't know who wrote it, or to whom, but in several courtly poems of the era, hawks symbolized heirs to the throne. Make of that what you will. The princes themselves were not immune to these games. Fernando, the elder, was now 12 and increasingly aware of his place as the kingdom's future. Accounts describe him as solemn, burdened beyond his years. Rodrigo, in contrast, remained impulsive and irreverent, a streak that earned him equal parts admiration and quiet concern. It is during this period that an unusual figure enters the story: Fray Sebastián, a Dominican monk sent to tutor the boys in matters of faith and philosophy. Later writings describe Sebastián as charismatic, eloquent, and, according to one scandalous accusation, dangerously persuasive. He often spoke of destiny, of divine will shaping royal bloodlines, and of storms that wash away unworthy kings. Some scholars believe Sebastián was simply a passionate teacher. Others suspect he was a pawn placed by one of the noble factions, subtly shaping the prince's loyalties, or perhaps even their fears. There's also the curious case of the disappearing servants. Over a span of 2 years, at least 5 attendants assigned to the princes either left suddenly or were quietly reassigned without explanation. One vanished entirely from the records, her name scraped clean from the palace rolls. We know almost nothing about her except a single surviving note in a steward's ledger: "She knew too much." Knew what, exactly? That's the question no one can answer. And then came the poisoning. No, not of the princes. Not yet. During a summer feast at the palace, several noblemen fell violently ill after drinking from a cask of imported wine. Contemporary rumors claim the poison was meant for the king, though historians caution against assuming too much. Still, the timing is impossible to ignore. Just days earlier, the king had rejected a petition from the Velasquez seeking expanded rights over a lucrative iron mine. Coincidence? Probably not. Even more unsettling, the poisoned cask was delivered by a supplier connected directly to the monastery where the princes would later disappear. Court tensions escalated in the months that followed. Every banquet felt like a battlefield, every whispered conversation a potential conspiracy. Chroniclers describe nobles refusing to eat food they hadn't seen prepared themselves, guards doubling their night patrols, and astrologers warning of blood on the moon. It is around this time that Rodrigo begins behaving strangely. Letters from his tutor note recurring nightmares, mutterings about doors in the dark, and, most disturbingly, a growing distrust of everyone, including his brother. Some interpret this as youthful anxiety. Others suspect someone at court was deliberately feeding his fears, isolating him from potential allies. Fernando, meanwhile, was being groomed more aggressively than ever. His days were filled with diplomatic training, his nights with lessons on military tactics. A surviving fragment of his personal journal, one of the few we have, contains a haunting line: "They say a crown weighs nothing. They lie." By now, the atmosphere in Oviedo had curdled into something thick and unspoken, the kind of tension you can feel in your teeth. Foreign envoys arrived with suspicious frequency, emissaries from Aragon and Portugal, visiting the court under the guise of trade negotiations. Behind closed doors, Guzman and Velasco traded accusations of treason while the king tried, and failed, to maintain control. And somewhere in the middle of it all, 2 boys carried on with their studies, laughing in sunlit courtyards, playing chess in the evenings, never realizing how many of the adults around them were already imagining a future in which they no longer existed. Today, if you wander the royal archives in Oviedo, you'll find an innocuous wooden chest labeled Correspondencias Varias, Año 1398. Inside are scraps of letters, fragments of wax seals, and one tiny rolled parchment that reads simply, "The brothers will sleep by summer's end." The handwriting remains unidentified, and if you pause too long in that dim little archive, you might almost hear the faint scratching of a quill across parchment. Centuries-old ink drying beneath candlelight. As another piece of the puzzle slides into place, the trap was tightening. The princes just didn't know it yet. The palace smelled of roasted boar and spiced honey that night, but beneath the feasting aromas lay something else, something sour, sharp, and metallic, like fear left too long in the sun. It was midsummer when the royal household gathered for the feast of St. James, a celebration meant to showcase unity among Asturias's fractious nobility. Tapestries hung heavy along the walls of the grand hall, their embroidered saints staring down impassively at the mortals below. Silver candelabras flickered on polished oak tables. Wine ran like a river, and laughter rose easily, too easily, perhaps, considering how many of the people present would rather see each other dead. And at the center of it all, seated side by side beneath the royal crest, were the two young princes. Fernando, now 13, sat upright, wearing the expression of someone who knows every gesture is being measured against a crown he hasn't yet earned. Rodrigo, 11 and restless, kept fidgeting with his dagger, spinning it idly until his brother stilled his hand with a quiet glance. It should have been a night of celebration, but the tension crackled like dry kindling. According to palace records, nearly every major noble house attended, the Velasquez, the Guzmans, the Quiñones, and half a dozen lesser lords whose loyalty could never quite be trusted. At first glance, the evening unfolded with polished civility, songs, toasts, and polite laughter echoing beneath the vaulted ceilings. But buried in the chronicles are fragments of conversations caught half-heard. Lines that make the stomach tighten even now. One servant claimed to overhear Count Nuño de Guzman mutter, "Better a kingdom without heirs than heirs without loyalty." Meanwhile, Doña Inés de Velasco, formidable as ever, reportedly warned her retinue to watch the cups and watch the priests, which seems like excellent advice for any medieval gathering but carries a particular chill here. Then there are the omens, always the omens. A chronicler describes how, as the first course was served, a single raven circled the open courtyard above the hall, cawing harshly before vanishing into the night. A small thing, perhaps, but superstitions ran deep in Asturias, and some guests crossed themselves discreetly while others exchanged worried looks. Later in the evening, as musicians played a soft pavane, one of the palace dogs, a massive hound named Bruto, suddenly howled, broke free of its handler, and ran straight from the hall. No one could coax it back. Within days, Bruto would disappear entirely, never seen again. Historians still argue whether these were simple coincidences inflated by later retellings or whether something more deliberate was unfolding. After all, omens are often retrofitted to tragedies, but sometimes they're warnings ignored. An especially intriguing account comes from the steward's ledger for that night. Among the listed provisions, everything is routine: boar, venison, saffron cakes, until one peculiar entry: 2 sealed casks, marked for the high table only. No origin is listed for these casks. No receipts, no supplier's notes, nothing. And yet, according to testimony recorded decades later, several guests remarked on the strange sweetness of the wine served to the royal family. No one became ill, at least not immediately, but this unexplained anomaly has fueled centuries of speculation. Throughout the evening, observers noted that Fernando and Rodrigo were unusually quiet. The princes, normally animated in each other's company, seemed subdued, distracted. One court poet writes, "The elder's gaze wandered the rafters. The younger traced circles in spilled wine. Was it just adolescent boredom? Or did they sense, somehow, that unseen hands were rearranging the pieces of their lives?" Adding weight to this theory is a recovered letter from Fray Sebastián, their tutor, discovered in the archives of Leon. "They are not safe here. I smell deceit in the incense." He penned it 3 days before the feast. The letter was never sent. And then there's the matter of the seating arrangement. Careful analysis of the surviving guest lists shows that Count Nuño de Guzman sat unusually close to the princes that night, close enough to whisper. Too close for coincidence. Directly opposite him sat Doña Inés de Velasco, whose expression, according to one witness, could have soured milk. Between them, the air must have been thick enough to chew. Some scholars believe Guzman offered the boys reassurances that night, perhaps even secret promises of protection, while others suspect he planted doubts, driving a wedge between them and their remaining allies. Unfortunately, no first-hand testimony from the princes survives. Their voices are already fading from the record here, like candlelight swallowed by shadow. By the time the feast reached its final course, the unease had deepened. Several guests reportedly left early, citing illness or unfinished business, though others whispered of omens too dire to ignore. One anonymous chronicler claims that, as the hall emptied, a storm gathered unnaturally fast over the palace. Lightning lit the sky, and thunder rolled like distant drums. Rodrigo, restless and half asleep at the table, is said to have whispered something to his brother just before the feast ended. No one knows what he said, but one serving boy remembered Fernando's face tightening as though in dread. It was the last recorded public appearance of the princes. The next day, the palace was quiet. Servants reported seeing the princes playing chess in the library that afternoon. Others swear they were in the gardens, feeding the swans. By nightfall, though, their chambers stood empty. No one remembers hearing them leave. No one remembers seeing them taken. No one remembers anything at all. And yet, everyone seems to agree on one thing. Whatever happened next was set in motion that night. At that final feast, beneath the soft flicker of candles and the watchful eyes of saints stitched into tapestry, the stage was prepared. The trap was sprung. They just hadn't noticed yet. The night the princes vanished was thick with summer heat, the kind that clings to skin and slows breath. Outside the palace walls, Oviedo slept under a veiled moon, its cobblestone streets glimmering faintly with dew. Inside, servants moved like muted shadows, clearing the last remnants of the feast, while distant thunder rolled low across the Cantabrian mountains. The palace clock told midnight. Somewhere deep within its labyrinthine halls, 2 boys closed the door to their chambers for the last time. By dawn, they were gone. The earliest witness statements, collected hastily in the days that followed, agree on one thing. No one heard a sound. No cries. No struggle. Not even footsteps on the cold stone floors. And yet, when the chamber doors were opened, their beds lay untouched, their boots missing, and the heavy oak shutters bolted from the inside. Bolted from the inside. Historians still argue about this detail. Did someone stage the scene to look like an impossible disappearance? Or did the princes somehow slip away without disturbing the locks? Either answer raises more questions than it solves. On the writing desk between their beds, a half-played chessboard remained frozen in time. Fernando's white bishop stood poised for checkmate, and Rodrigo's black knight lay tipped over, as though struck mid-move. A single wax candle had burned itself down to a crooked spine of ash. And then there's the most unsettling clue of all, a scrap of parchment, folded neatly beneath the board, bearing only 3 words in hurried, smudged ink. They are here. The king's response was immediate and ferocious. Before sunrise, palace gates were sealed, and riders dispatched to every road, bridge, and forest path within 20 leagues. Every servant was interrogated, every chamber searched. The monastery where the boys once studied was ransacked from crypt to bell tower. Nothing. The royal guard swore under oath that no one entered or left the palace that night. No unlocked gates, no missing horses, no secret passages unaccounted for. It was as though the princes had simply evaporated. But the silence didn't last long. Within days, rumors rippled through the court like wildfire. Some whispered of kidnapping, pointing fingers at Count Nuño de Guzman, who had been seen slipping into the eastern wing shortly before midnight. Others accused the Velasquez, claiming they planned to hide the boys until Fernando came of age and could be controlled as their puppet king. And then, of course, there were the darker theories, the ones that crawl beneath your skin if you let them linger too long. A stable hand claimed he saw two hooded figures leading children through the gardens just before the bells tolled midnight. A laundress swore she heard chanting from beneath the palace chapel. One priest insisted the boys were taken by divine hand, as punishment for some unnamed sin. None of these accounts could be proven, but none of them could be disproven, either. Among the palace records from that week is a strange note in the steward's handwriting. The lower cellars are to remain sealed. No exceptions. It isn't signed. It isn't explained. And no record survives of anyone revisiting those cellars for nearly 40 years. Fray Sebastian, the prince's tutor, proved an equally confounding figure in the investigation. Questioned by the king himself, he claimed ignorance, but his letters, discovered centuries later, suggest otherwise. In one, dated just 2 nights before the disappearance, he wrote cryptically, "They dream now of the river. I hear the waters calling." Some historians interpret this as a metaphor, a monk's overwrought poetry. Others suspect he knew far more than he admitted. A few fringe theorists even suggest Sebastian helped smuggle the princes out of Asturias entirely. One fragment from a palace guard's testimony offers another disturbing possibility. "I saw a light moving beyond the orchard wall after midnight, like a lantern swinging low. I called out, but no one answered. When pressed, the guard insisted he saw 2 smaller shapes moving beside it. Children, perhaps, or maybe shadows playing tricks in the heat-heavy dark." He disappeared less than a month later. Dismissed, without record. Even more unsettling are the traces found days later deep within the palace gardens. Hidden beneath a tangle of ivy near the old orchard wall lay a set of footprints, small, barefoot, pressed into soft earth. They stopped abruptly at the edge of a narrow, fast-running creek. No further prints on the opposite bank. And no drag marks, either. It's as though the earth swallowed them whole. The public was told nothing. Official proclamations made no mention of the prince's disappearance, as though ignoring it would make it less real. Yet gossip bled through locked gates, spreading from Oviedo's markets to the fishing villages along the northern coast. Mothers whispered prayers for the lost heirs, while shepherds claimed to see pale figures wandering the misty hills at dawn. Some villagers even claimed the boys had been spirited away by Los Caminantes, the walkers between worlds. Folkloric beings said to lure children under riverbeds where time flows differently. Most historians dismiss this as superstition. But one peculiar thing remains. The Nalón River, twisting through Asturias, has long been associated with such legends. And remember, the monastery where the princes once studied sits right along its bend. To this day, no one knows whether the boys left the palace of their own will, were taken, or something else entirely. But here's the part that chills even hardened skeptics. In 1823, nearly 5 centuries after the disappearance, workers restoring the palace uncovered a narrow tunnel beneath the prince's chambers. Inside lay a single wooden toy horse, half-rotted and headless. Carved into its underside, barely legible, were the words, "We are not afraid." And yet, the silence that followed their disappearance suggests someone was. Because from that night forward, the court never spoke their names again. The morning after the princes vanished, the palace was no longer a home, it was a nest of vipers. Every corridor echoed with hurried footsteps. Servants whispered behind their hands. Guards clutched their pikes tighter. And in the council chambers, accusations began to fly before breakfast had even been served. Someone had taken the heirs to the throne. Someone inside these walls. And the list of suspects was long. First and foremost was Count Nuño de Guzman, master of intrigue, patron of whispers, smiling spider at the center of this web. He had the strongest motive. Removing the princes would leave the succession vulnerable. And Guzman's faction could insert their own puppet onto the throne. There are records of his movements that night. He swore under oath that he retired to his chambers before the feast ended, but one servant claims otherwise. In testimony preserved in the royal archives, she insists she saw Guzman entering the eastern wing near midnight, his cloak drawn, his steps silent. Of course, Guzman denied it, but when pressed to name witnesses who saw him elsewhere, none came forward, not one. Standing opposite him was Doña Inés de Velasco, equally powerful and far less subtle. Her family commanded the western passes, controlled the mines, and held enough soldiers to challenge the crown directly if provoked. Removing the princes wouldn't make her queen, but it would destabilize the throne, creating exactly the kind of chaos in which power-hungry families thrive. A curious detail strengthens this suspicion. The night before the feast, Inés's personal physician signed out from the royal apothecary several vials of sleeping draughts. Officially, they were intended to treat her recurring migraines. Unofficially, we can't know, but none of those vials were ever returned. Then there's Fray Sebastian, the prince's tutor. On paper, he had no obvious motive. A monk sworn to poverty and loyalty should have had nothing to gain. And yet, his letters, those unsettling fragments we've already touched on, suggest a man increasingly consumed by apocalyptic visions. One particularly cryptic passage reads, "Two rivers converge beneath the shadowed hills, and the blood of kings will choose one path or the other." Scholars debate whether this is symbolic or literal. Some interpret it as a warning that the boys were being led away from the palace by factions loyal to opposing houses. Others see it as proof Sebastian was himself orchestrating their protection, spiriting them to safety beneath the king's nose. Was he savior or saboteur? Historians are still arguing about it 600 years later. We also can't ignore foreign influence. At the time, Asturias was entangled in the broader conflicts of Castile, Aragon, Portugal, and England. Each kingdom had spies seated within the court, and each had reasons to destabilize the line of succession. Letters discovered in Lisbon centuries later mention a gift of silence delivered unto the northern court, sent just weeks before the disappearance. A bribe? A coded confession? Or simply another red herring in a case already drowning in them? And then, of course, there's the king himself. King Henry III has long been the most divisive figure in this mystery. To his supporters, he was a grieving father, blindsided by tragedy. To his critics, he was a calculating politician who saw in his sons not legacy, but liability. Historians still argue fiercely over one damning piece of evidence, a sealed decree discovered in the royal archives, dated the month before the princes vanished. Its contents remain partially illegible, but the surviving fragment reads, "Should the elder falter, the younger must not succeed. Make of that what you will." Here's where the threads tangle further. 3 weeks after the disappearance, the Velasquez accused Guzman of orchestrating a kidnapping. Guzman retaliated by alleging the Velasquez poisoned the royal casks to cover their tracks. The king publicly condemned neither faction but quietly stripped both families of certain privileges, a decision that enraged them equally. Within months, Asturias was bracing for civil war. Armies began gathering in secret. Roads were patrolled heavily. Anyone carrying letters without royal seals risked arrest. And yet, no one could produce a single shred of definitive evidence tying any faction to the missing boys. The absence of proof doesn't mean the absence of guilt, though. In 1627, long after the monarchy had changed hands, restoration work at Oviedo uncovered a series of tunnels beneath the old palace. Among the debris, workers found a fragment of parchment preserved in wax. The handwriting matched that of Guzman's steward. It contained only 5 words. "The hawks have been grounded." This phrase appears in several coded letters from the period, often referencing the princes. Some historians argue this is the smoking gun proving Guzman's complicity. Others suggest it's simply another faction's attempt to implicate him centuries after the fact. We're left with possibilities stacked upon possibilities, like mirrors reflecting each other into infinity. And then, there's an even stranger twist. A chronicler in Aragon claims he saw 2 foreign boys of noble bearing arrive at a secluded monastery months after the disappearance. He describes them as pale, withdrawn, and speaking a dialect of the northern hills. The records break off before he names them, and no evidence links this account directly to Asturias. But every few decades, another story emerges like this. Sightings in Portugal, claims in Burgundy, even whispers from as far away as Naples. Always the same details. 2 boys, quiet as ghosts, traveling under false names. Are they echoes of the truth? Or just folklore layering fantasy over grief? By now, the suspects number more than we can count, and motives knot together until they're almost impossible to untangle. Perhaps that was the plan all along. Because when everyone has a reason, No one can ever be guilty. And yet, in the silence surrounding their disappearance, one fact rings louder than any accusation. Somebody knew exactly what happened. And they carried that knowledge to their grave. Beneath the grand spires of San Salvador Abbey in Oviedo lies a world few ever see, a labyrinth of damp tunnels, sealed chambers, and echoes so old they seem to carry voices not entirely of this century. For centuries, these passages were whispered about in the streets of Asturias, dismissed by most as superstition. But when the princes vanished, all roads, metaphorically and perhaps literally, led here. The abbey had always been tied to the royal family. Its monks guarded relics, copied decrees, and, occasionally, hid secrets better left untouched. And yet, for generations, no one had spoken openly of the tunnels beneath its crypts. Until, decades after the disappearance, a monk's fragmented confession surfaced in an obscure collection of diocesan records. We should not have opened the gate. The brothers were never meant to see what lay beneath. The tunnels were rediscovered in the 17th century during repairs to the abbey's foundations. What the workers found was unsettling. A vast network of narrow stone corridors carved deep into the rock, branching in directions that defied logic. Some ran beneath the abbey grounds, others extended toward the old palace, and one narrow shaft ended abruptly beneath the eastern orchard wall of the royal gardens. If you remember from earlier, that orchard is where barefoot footprints, believed to belong to the princes, simply ended at a creek bank the night they disappeared. Historians still argue whether these tunnels were meant as escape routes, smuggling passages, or something stranger altogether, but there's one fact everyone agrees on. They were deliberately sealed in the years following the disappearance. Why? That's where things get murky. One theory comes from the so-called Codex of Covadonga, a collection of secret monastic writings from the late 14th century. It describes rooms beneath rooms, filled with painted warnings, older than the abbey itself. One chilling passage reads, "Beneath the third bell, the stones remember, but to disturb their memory is to lose one's name." It's poetic, cryptic, and haunting. Some scholars interpret losing one's name as symbolic of damnation. But others think it hints at deliberate erasure, families, lineages, entire histories wiped clean. And when you pair that with the fact that the princes' names vanish from official records within weeks of their disappearance, it's hard not to wonder if the two are connected. In 1894, archaeologists returned to the abbey tunnels armed with modern equipment and stubborn curiosity. What they found has divided the academic world ever since. Deep beneath the main crypt, behind a collapsed section of wall, lay a chamber sealed so tightly it hadn't been opened in centuries. Inside, they discovered remnants of wooden furniture, fragments of embroidered fabric, and on the far wall, a faded mural. The image depicts two crowned boys kneeling beneath a river of stars, their hands clasped as if in prayer. Behind them looms a figure robed in black, faceless and vast, stretching long, thin arms around the children as if in protection or possession. At the mural's base, scratched into the plaster, was a single Latin phrase, "Sub umbra perirunt," beneath the shadow, they perished. But here's where it gets stranger. Tucked into a crevice behind the mural was a small bundle wrapped in waxed linen. Inside lay a ring bearing the royal crest of Asturias, matched by experts to Fernando's known belongings, and a lock of dark hair tied with red silk. The bundle had been deliberately hidden, as though someone wanted it preserved but never found. If the princes truly died here, why bury these fragments so carefully? And why leave no bones? No trace of their bodies? Nothing but whispers etched into stone? Folklore complicates things further. Local legends claim that beneath the abbey runs a third river, an underground stream believed to carry away what must not remain. It's said the monks feared its waters, believing they erased memory itself. Some historians dismiss this as myth. Others note an odd detail. Geological surveys confirm the existence of a subterranean waterway beneath the abbey complex. Its current is fast, cold, and deep enough to carry anything, or anyone, far downstream. Perhaps to vanish forever into the Nalon River. And remember, the prince's final tutor, Fray Sebastian, once wrote, "They dream now of the river. I hear the waters calling." Was that a metaphor, or a confession? One particularly unnerving clue emerged during restoration in 1952, when workers uncovered a fragment of an oak door deep in the tunnels. It bore deep gouges, as though from fingernails. Testing revealed human skin cells trapped in the splinters. Degraded but undeniably real. Pinned to the door with a rusted iron nail was a sliver of parchment. Its ink nearly vanished. "Forgive us. We meant to save them." No one knows who wrote it, or when. Historians remain divided over what the abbey tunnels represent. The hidden escape theory. The princes were smuggled out beneath the abbey to safety. Perhaps spirited away to Aragon or Portugal. The silent tomb theory. The tunnels became their grave, concealed to avoid scandal or rebellion. The erasure theory. Something so dark occurred beneath those stones that everyone involved swore never to speak of it, because to name it was to invite ruin. Whatever happened here, the abbey's shadow lingers over the entire mystery like a second skin. And yet, perhaps the most chilling fact is this: the tunnels beneath San Salvador Abbey remain officially sealed to this day. But locals claim that, on certain nights, if you stand in the cloister and press your ear to the cold flagstones, you can hear running water far below. And faintly, just faintly, the sound of two boys laughing. The cache of forbidden letters was discovered by accident, or at least, that's what the archivists claimed. In 1732, workers repairing a collapsed section of the royal chancery of Oviedo stumbled upon a sealed cedar chest wedged deep behind a wall. Inside, preserved by centuries of dry stone and cedar oil, lay a bundle of correspondence wrapped in crimson silk. The letters were unsigned, unsealed, and undated, but the handwriting matched several figures from the Asturian court during the years of the prince's disappearance. And if their contents are to be believed, someone was orchestrating something far larger than a simple kidnapping. The first letter reads like an instruction manual, its language chillingly detached. The falcons must not leave their roost until the moon wanes. Keep the doors bolted and silence the bells. The river is ready. Historians still argue about this phrasing. Falcons appear repeatedly in royal correspondence from the time, almost certainly a code for the princes. But what is the river? Is it literal, the Nalon, whose bend hides the monastery where the boys studied, or symbolic, implying some other passage, perhaps even death? The second letter is shorter but somehow worse. 2 keys, 1 lock. The elder must not know until the moment comes. 2 keys, 1 lock. Was this a secret escape? Or the finality of something far more sinister? Later letters grow increasingly desperate, as though whatever was planned was spiraling out of control. If they are found, all will unravel. The bells are ready. No witnesses. Do not trust the monk. That last line has caused endless debate. Was Fray Sebastian, the prince's tutor and spiritual guide, the architect of their escape? Or was he betrayed by others? His role warped by rumor? We'll likely never know. But paired with his earlier writings about rivers calling and dreams beneath shadowed hills, these cryptic instructions make his presence impossible to ignore. One letter stands apart from the rest. Its handwriting is smooth, elegant, deliberate, matching none of the others. It contains just 7 words. The crown will not suffer their blood. The phrasing has led some historians to suspect this was written by someone within the royal household itself, perhaps even the king. But no signature, no seal, no definitive proof. Skeptics argue the letters are forgeries, crafted centuries later to sell mystery and scandal. After all, nothing sells quite like tragedy. But if they are fakes, they're meticulous ones. The ink composition, parchment quality, and watermarks all date cleanly to the late 14th century. And here's the kicker. Several details in these letters align disturbingly well with other independent records. One references 2 sealed casks, sent to the royal feast, the same unexplained entry we saw in the steward's ledger. Another mentions a narrow passage, leading from the abbey crypt to the eastern orchard wall, discovered centuries later during excavation. A final fragment notes, almost casually, that the bells must stay silent. Remember the monk's journal? The bells did not toll. Too many coincidences for comfort. The letters were immediately classified upon discovery, locked away in the royal archives. Only a handful of scholars have ever been granted access, and even fewer are allowed to publish their findings. One such historian, Dr. Lucia Santamaria devoted her life to decoding their hidden meanings. Before her death in 1984, she gave a rare interview in which she said something unsettling. "These are not just letters. They are confessions, and every confession is also a lie." When pressed to explain, she refused, simply adding, "If the truth were meant to be known, the letters would never have been hidden." Of course, where there are secrets, there are forgeries. In the decades since, countless fakes have surfaced. Letters claiming the princes were poisoned, smuggled to Aragon, even spirited away to a secret monastery in the Pyrenees. Most are easy to dismiss, but a few defy certainty. Take, for example, the so-called Valdidios fragment, uncovered in a private collection in 1917. It's little more than a torn scrap, but its content chills the blood. "They will walk beneath the stones where no shadows follow." Scholars familiar with the Abbey tunnels argue this could only have been written by someone who knew of their existence, a detail supposedly erased from all surviving documents after the princes vanished. The letters paint a picture both clearer and murkier at the same time. Clearer, because they confirm beyond doubt that there was a coordinated effort involving multiple people to do something with the princes. Murkier, because we still don't know whether that something was saving them or silencing them. And then there's the final, most controversial discovery, the sealed envelope at the bottom of the chest. Unlike the others, this one bore a wax seal stamped with the royal crest of Asturias. For centuries, it remained unopened, its contents a mystery, but in 1998, after a heated legal battle among historians, the seal was broken. Inside was a single sheet of parchment. The handwriting has been verified as authentic. The words are simple. They are beneath us still. No date, no context, no signature, just 7 words, and 600 years of silence. To this day, the letters remain locked away, guarded by Spain's National Historical Archive. Access requests are routinely denied without explanation. But archivists whisper one warning to those who persist. Be careful what you want to find. Some ghosts prefer to stay hidden. Mist clings to the peaks of the Picos de Europa, veiling the ancient shrine of Covadonga in pale silence. If Asturias has a soul, many say it lives here, among the moss-draped cliffs, the echoing caves, and the river that roars like distant thunder beneath the mountains. Pilgrims come to pray where legend claims the Reconquista began. But locals will warn you, after midnight, this place belongs to the ghosts. And always, those ghosts are said to be 2 boys. The first recorded sighting dates back to 1457. Less than a century after the prince's disappearance, a shepherd named Diego Suarez claimed he saw 2 pale children standing barefoot in the shallow waters of the Covadonga River at dawn. He described them as wearing robes of white, though unstained by mud, and noted something peculiar: neither boy's reflection appeared in the water. The record ends abruptly with a note from the parish priest. Diego took ill after his vision and spoke no more of it. After that, the reports trickled steadily through the centuries. In 1561, a traveling merchant wrote in his journal about stopping overnight at a hamlet near Covadonga. He described being awoken by the sound of children laughing outside his window. When he peered out, he saw 2 boys chasing each other in the mist. One older, one younger. He called to them, no response. The figures darted behind a nearby grove, but when he followed, the ground there was undisturbed, untouched, as though no one had walked upon it. A curious coincidence, perhaps, except the merchant included a sketch of the boys. And centuries later, historians compared it to verified portraits of the princes from court archives. The resemblance is unsettling. By the 18th century, Covadonga had become a pilgrimage site not just for the faithful but for those chasing whispers. Noble families from across Spain sent envoys to investigate, quietly hoping the princes had somehow survived and left descendants hidden among these hills. Most returned empty-handed, some never returned at all. Folklore deepened with every generation. Locals began to refer to the boys as Los Hermanos Silenciosos, the Silent Brothers. Children were warned not to wander the riverbanks at twilight, lest the brothers invite them beneath the waters, where no shadows fall. And then there's the Chapel of the Forgotten Names, built into a cliffside overlooking the river. The tiny stone chapel bears no inscription, But inside are two unmarked coffins, empty, sealed centuries ago, and never opened. Monastic records call them relics without relics, though no one seems to know who commissioned them, or why. Skeptics argue, of course, that these sightings are nothing more than collective guilt transformed into story. The disappearance of two heirs, boys beloved by the people, would haunt any kingdom. So why wouldn't their ghosts appear in every shadow? But here's the thing. Not all sightings come from villagers prone to superstition. In 1823, during palace renovations, an architect named Joaquin del Alamo reported an encounter in the archives beneath Oviedo. While surveying collapsed vaults, he claimed to hear faint voices reciting what sounded like prayers. Following the sound led him to a sealed doorway etched with the royal crest. He placed his ear against the cold stone and swore he heard one child whisper, "We are not cold here." The doorway has since been walled off. Even modern accounts persist. In 1954, a Spanish historian named Dr. Enrique Sanabria visited Covadonga to research regional folklore. His notes, later donated to the University of Oviedo, describe waking in the middle of the night to see two boys standing at the foot of his bed. Their faces were indistinct, blurred as if seen through rippling water. They didn't speak, but when he reached for his lamp, they vanished. Sanabria left Asturias the next morning. He never published his findings and refused to speak of the experience for the rest of his life. Historians still argue about the Covadonga phenomenon. Is it folklore, fueled by longing and guilt? Is it psychological, mass suggestion shaped by centuries of storytelling? Or could there be something more? Because, here's where the lines between story and evidence begin to blur. In 1994, divers exploring the subterranean river beneath Covadonga discovered a carved lintel deep underwater. Its inscription, though heavily eroded, remains partially legible. Hic dormient filii regis. Here sleep the sons of the king. No bones were found, no coffins, just the carving, and, disturbingly, two tiny footprints impressed into the limestone floor nearby, perfectly preserved by mineral deposits. Geological dating confirmed the footprints predate the divers by at least 5 centuries. So perhaps the legends of Covadonga aren't simply echoes of grief after all. Perhaps the brothers really did pass through here, whether in life, in death, or in something stranger we have no words for. Because when enough generations whisper the same story, you have to wonder, are they remembering something we've forgotten? And yet, despite centuries of sightings and relics, one fact remains. No one has ever proven the prince's fate. Their names were erased from court records. Their portraits removed from palace walls. Their memories scrubbed as though Asturias itself wanted to forget. But Covadonga remembers. And maybe, on mist-heavy nights, so do they. The bells of San Salvador Cathedral rang softly on the morning after the princes vanished. As though the entire city held its breath. But inside the palace walls, silence reigned. King Henry III emerged from his private chambers pale, rigid, and composed, a man carved from stone, offering no outward sign of grief. To those who served him closely, that silence spoke louder than any lamentation. Not a proclamation, not a prayer, not even a public search ordered in his sons' names. And that has haunted historians for centuries. If you believe the official record, the king convened his council in secret within hours of discovering the disappearance. No minutes of that meeting survive. No chronicler was allowed inside. Yet an unsigned note preserved in the royal archives hints at the tone of the gathering. The names are never to be spoken. The order was absolute. Within a month, portraits of Fernando and Rodrigo disappeared from palace walls. Official records mentioning their existence were quietly revised. Future genealogies of Asturias began listing a succession anomaly, a blank space where their names should have been. It's as though the princes were being erased deliberately, one quill stroke at a time. Historians still argue over what this silence means. Some see a grieving father whose sorrow eclipsed governance, a man unable to endure reminders of his sons. Others interpret it as guilt, proof that the crown itself orchestrated their disappearance to consolidate power. And then there's the sealed decree we touched on earlier, dated mere weeks before the princes vanished. The surviving fragment reads, "Should the elder falter, the younger must not succeed." Some scholars insist this was an administrative document, perhaps relating to guardianship or succession contingency plans. Others suspect it's something far darker, a royal authorization to ensure neither boy ever reached the throne. The king's subsequent actions only deepen the mystery. Just days after the disappearance, Count Nuno de Guzman, the man most loudly accused by rival factions, was quietly reassigned to govern distant Leon. Hundreds of kilometers from Oviedo. Publicly, this looked like exile. Privately, Guzman's influence only seemed to grow. Meanwhile, Doña Inés de Velasco, matriarch of the rival house, was granted unprecedented mining rights in western Asturias, a concession so generous it silenced her family's accusations overnight. Was this diplomacy, or payoff? And then there's the strangest decision of all. Within a year, the king dissolved the prince's household entirely. Their tutors dismissed, their servants scattered, their guards reassigned to distant posts. It was as if Henry wanted no living soul left who had known his sons intimately. One letter from a dismissed attendant survives, tucked inside a private collection discovered in 1912. Its words are raw, desperate. We are not to speak of them. Not their faces, not their voices, not even the sound of their laughter. It is as though they were never born. The writer ends abruptly. God forgive us, I cannot. And yet, the king's public image never faltered. He appeared at feasts, presided over council sessions, and announced reforms to strengthen the realm. Chroniclers of the time describe him as renewed in vigor, as though freed from some unseen burden. Was that composure the mask of a father concealing heartbreak? Or the satisfaction of a ruler who had resolved a dangerous threat to his throne? There's one detail here that gnaws at modern historians. While Asturias remained silent, neighboring courts were not. Surviving correspondence between Aragonese envoys suggests that whispers of royal scandal had already reached their ears. One letter, dated mere months after the disappearance, reads, "The northern crown binds itself with silence. Blood has been spilled, but whose hand holds the knife remains unknown. Even abroad, everyone seemed to understand one thing. This was no accident." Then there's the unsettling coincidence involving the Abbey tunnels. As we know, excavations centuries later revealed passages connecting the royal gardens directly to the monastery crypts. Shortly after the princes disappeared, the king ordered those crypts sealed indefinitely. His decree is stark, unambiguous, and chilling. None shall disturb what sleeps beneath. No explanation, no elaboration. And when paired with the letters we uncovered earlier, the ones hinting that the river is ready, and the hawks must not leave their roost, it's difficult not to see deliberate orchestration hidden beneath layers of denial. Still, not all scholars agree on the king's guilt. A competing theory argues that Henry was covering up something he didn't control. In this reading, his silence wasn't born of complicity but of terror, silencing the kingdom to protect it from truths too destabilizing to name. Was there a faction within the court acting independently, beyond even the king's reach? Were foreign agents involved, pulling Asturias into a wider game? Or, perhaps most chillingly, did the king know what happened but could never admit it, not to his people? And maybe not even to himself? The weight of this silence lingers even now. When the Royal Archives in Madrid digitized a portion of their Asturian holdings in 2004, researchers discovered dozens of encrypted documents tied to this period, most still unreadable. Access requests for the originals remain under review. And in the Cathedral of San Salvador, beneath a mosaic depicting Asturias's royal lineage, there remains a deliberate gap, an unadorned space between two crowned medallions. No names, no dates, just empty stone, as if history itself chose to look away. Perhaps the king ordered their disappearance. Perhaps he simply couldn't prevent it. Either way, his silence ensured the truth was buried so deeply we're still digging 600 years later. And yet, silence has a strange quality. Sometimes it hides secrets, sometimes it is the secret. Rain lashes the sandstone walls of Oviedo Cathedral, rattling against stained glass windows like a warning unheeded for centuries. Inside, scaffolding creaks softly as restoration workers lower themselves into the crypt beneath the altar, a space untouched by human hands for nearly 600 years. It is October, 1949, when the first bone is found. The discovery begins innocuously enough. A restoration team repairing the cathedral's foundations breaks through an unmarked section of masonry beneath the main nave. Behind it lies a narrow, dust-choked passage, sealed deliberately with layers of stone. At the end of the corridor, they uncover a hidden chamber, roughly hewn, its walls slick with condensation. What they find inside will ignite decades of controversy. The chamber contains 2 wooden coffers. Side by side, they're small, unadorned, and locked with iron clasps rusted shut. No inscriptions mark them, no seals, no dedications to saints or martyrs, nothing to indicate who lies within. When opened, each coffer reveals a skeleton. The bones belong to 2 children, estimated at ages 11 and 13. Their positioning is deliberate. Hands crossed neatly over ribs, heads resting on simple linen pillows that have long since rotted to dust. But here's the detail that sends shivers through everyone present: their skulls are missing. Historians still argue bitterly about this discovery. Are these the remains of Fernando and Rodrigo, the lost princes of Asturias? Or does the evidence point elsewhere entirely? Supporters of the bones belong to the princes theory point to several unsettling coincidences. The chamber lies directly beneath the section of the cathedral where royal processions once paused during coronations. A faded fragment of a mural nearby depicts 2 crowned boys kneeling beneath a blazing star, a motif eerily similar to the mural uncovered earlier beneath the abbey tunnels. Traces of red silk were found among the fragments of decayed fabric inside the coffers, the same material historically used for royal children's burial shrouds. And yet, there are equally persuasive counterarguments. For one, no royal records mention the burial of heirs beneath the cathedral, an omission unthinkable in an era when even distant cousins had elaborate funeral rites carefully recorded. Additionally, the skull's absence complicates identification. Without them, early anthropological efforts to match features or lineage were useless. Some believe the skulls were removed deliberately, perhaps to prevent recognition if the bodies were ever discovered. Others argue it suggests a ritualistic element, something darker, concealed beneath the veneer of royal politics. Remember those cryptic monastic writings we discussed earlier? The ones warning against losing one's name and disturbing stones that remember. A few scholars draw direct connections, proposing the boys were interred here without ceremony, their identities erased both symbolically and literally. Then there's the DNA testing controversy. In the early 2000s, Spanish authorities authorized limited genetic testing on tiny fragments of bone. Results were inconclusive, officially due to contamination. Unofficially, whispers claim the tests matched partial markers from documented descendants of the Asturian royal line. If true, the implications are staggering. But here's where it gets stranger. Shortly after these rumored findings, access to the bones was suspended indefinitely. Researchers were barred from the chamber. The official reason cited was structural instability of the crypt. To this day, requests to resume testing are quietly, consistently denied. And then, of course, there's the inscription. Near the coffers, scratched faintly into the stone floor, are 4 Latin words, half obscured by centuries of wear. Dormient sub silentio regum. Let them sleep beneath the silence of kings. Complicating matters further is the timeline of the cathedral's expansion. Historical blueprints suggest the chamber predates the current structure by at least 2 centuries, meaning it may have been built for another purpose entirely. If so, why enter royal children here, in secret, without records, and without even marking the site? Some theorists argue this chamber wasn't meant as a burial at all. Instead, they propose the princes were brought here after death, hidden deliberately beneath layers of stone and sanctity, out of sight, out of memory. Others, leaning on local folklore, whisper that the missing skulls were taken elsewhere entirely, used in a binding ritual meant to silence unrest in the kingdom. Outlandish? Certainly. But then again, in Asturias, even official history reads like a ghost story. One final detail complicates everything. Among the dust and bone fragments, archaeologists discovered a tiny carved medallion, no larger than a thumbprint. It bears the royal crest of Asturias, but the reverse is inscribed with 3 simple words in Old Castilian. On estamos aquí. We are still here. The medallion's authenticity has been confirmed. Its meaning hasn't. standing in that hidden chamber today, beneath the weight of centuries and saints' gazes above, it's hard not to feel that Asturias still keeps its secrets close. Did these coffers finally reveal the fate of the princes, or were they planted centuries ago to mislead those who came searching? Perhaps the answer lies elsewhere, deeper still, because silence can hide truth, but it can also bury lies. The mystery of the princes might have been buried beneath 6 centuries of silence, if not for the historians who refused to let it rest. In lecture halls, dusty archives, and late-night conferences lit by flickering slides, a war has been raging for decades, not with swords or armies, but with footnotes and fragments, carbon dating and whispered theories. Scholars are still divided into bitter factions, each convinced they've solved the riddle of Fernando and Rodrigo, the lost heirs of Asturias. But if there's one thing these experts agree on, it's this: every answer creates 3 new questions. Theory 1. The murder plot. The most mainstream narrative, supported by prominent voices like Dr. Javier Velasco of the University of Salamanca, paints a grim picture. According to this view, the princes were murdered within the palace itself. The suspects vary, but the motive remains constant: power. Removing both heirs cleared a path for rival claimants and allowed King Henry III to consolidate control without a drawn-out civil war. Evidence cited includes the sealed decree we discussed earlier: should the elder falter, the younger must not succeed. The letters referencing hawks and silent bells, implying deliberate orchestration. The sealed tunnels beneath the abbey and cathedral, suggesting bodies were concealed. But the murder theory has a glaring flaw: no bodies, at least. None conclusively identified. Without them, supporters are left arguing in circles, their case dependent on circumstantial breadcrumbs. Theory 2. The secret exile. Opposing the mainstream are historians like Dr. Lucia Santamaria, who spent her entire career immersed in Asturian archives. Before her death, she hinted that the truth was neither murder nor mercy, but something in between. Her belief? The princes were smuggled out of Asturias alive and raised in secret under false identities, possibly in Aragon or Portugal. Santamaria's key evidence was the Lisbon correspondence we touched on earlier, where an Aragonese envoy cryptically noted a gift of silence delivered unto the northern court. Adding weight to this theory are scattered records from remote Iberian monasteries noting 2 unnamed guests of noble bearing, appearing suddenly in 1399. Their descriptions, pale, withdrawn, speaking with a dialect of the northern hills, align eerily with contemporary portraits of the princes. Skeptics counter that such claims are fueled by confirmation bias. After all, countless noble children circulated Europe during this period, and yet, the coincidences persist. Theory 3. The ritual hypothesis. And then we reach the fringe. Some researchers, particularly those fascinated by the Codex of Covadonga and monastic folklore, believe the prince's disappearance was tied to something older, stranger, and darker than politics. They point to recurring themes: rivers, tunnels, silence, and names erased from history. The Codex warns, beneath the third bell, the stones remember. To wake them is to lose one's name. Was this metaphorical, or literal? Archaeologists examining carvings beneath the abbey and cathedral have noted symbols predating Christianity, tied to local pagan traditions involving water, sacrifice, and kingship. Combine this with missing skulls, vanished records, and murmurs of binding rituals, and you begin to see why some theorists believe the prince's fate was entwined with efforts to secure Asturias's future, not politically, but spiritually. Mainstream historians dismiss this outright. Yet more than one researcher who's ventured deep into the abbey tunnels has reported unsettling phenomena: faint whispers, sudden chills, even hearing what sounded like children laughing in the dark. Coincidence? Or something left behind? Forgers, fakes, and fabrications, adding chaos to chaos. The search for truth has attracted charlatans. Over the centuries, countless forged documents have surfaced. A confession from Count Nuño de Guzman, later exposed as an 18th-century fake. A set of skulls claimed to be the prince's, carbon dated to the wrong century. A supposed hidden will of King Henry III ordering their rescue, debunked by handwriting analysis. But here's the unsettling part. Among the mountain of fabrications, a few fragments resist easy dismissal. The Valdidio's fragment, for instance, they will walk beneath the stones where no shadows follow, has been authenticated multiple times. Why forge some pieces while hiding others so well? The locked archive. Perhaps the fiercest battle among historians isn't over theories but access. Deep within Spain's National Historical Archive, there's a sealed collection known unofficially as El Legajo de los Hermanos, the dossier of the brothers. It reportedly contains unredacted royal correspondence, court decrees, and, according to persistent rumor, an eyewitness account from someone who saw the princes after their disappearance. Access requests have been denied for decades. Officials claim the documents are too fragile to handle. Critics suspect something else. That whatever lies within threatens to upend not just Asturian history, but Spain's entire royal lineage. The consensus that isn't. The result of all this is less clarity, not more. Conferences end in shouting matches. Papers are published only to be ripped apart within weeks. No theory satisfies everyone. Perhaps that's the point. Because, as one scholar put it during a heated debate in 2012, when too many versions of the truth exist, someone has worked very hard to ensure we never find the real one. And here's the lingering question no one likes to ask aloud. What if the prince's disappearance isn't unsolved, but deliberately unsolvable? If the erasure was absolute, planned across generations, then maybe the silence itself is the answer. But if that's true, who wanted them forgotten so badly that 6 centuries later, we're still fighting over their ghosts? In 1473, nearly 80 years after the disappearance of Princes Fernando and Rodrigo, a forgotten diary surfaced in the private archives of the House of Quiñones, a once powerful Asturian noble family entwined deeply in the politics of the vanished heirs. It belonged to Martín de Ercilla, a lowly royal page who served in the Oviedo Palace during the fateful summer of 1398. The diary should never have survived. Its pages are brittle, its leather binding warped with damp, but its words are legible enough to unsettle even the most skeptical historian. Because Martín claims he saw what happened to the princes. The diary opens. The first pages are innocuous, mundane accounts of court gossip, kitchen shortages, and endless errands for the young lords. Martín describes Fernando as solemn and studious, Rodrigo as restless and mischievous, details that align perfectly with independent chronicles of the boys. But then, in late July, the tone shifts. They tell me not to ask about the sealed doors, but I hear footsteps beneath the stones at night. Sometimes, I think I hear laughter. 2 days later, Fray Sebastián visited the princes again. He said the river knows their names. When I asked what he meant, he smiled and told me to pray for silence. Already, Martín senses something beneath the surface. Servants whisper of meetings held past midnight, locked rooms beneath the abbey, and guests who arrive by shadows and leave by none. The night of the feast. Martin's entry on the night of the feast of St. James, the last time the princes were seen alive, is sparse but chilling. The elder played chess in the library before supper. The younger stared at the window as though listening to something I could not hear. At the table, Count Guzman spoke softly, and the boy would not meet his eyes. And then, a fragment. The wine tasted sweeter than usual. I drank nothing. The disappearance. The next entry, dated 2 days later, is the one that changed everything. I followed them. According to Martín, on the night of August 2nd, he was ordered to deliver candles to the abbey after dusk. Passing through the eastern orchard, he spotted 2 small figures walking between torches, escorted by 3 hooded men. He recognized their gait immediately. It was Fernando and Rodrigo. The younger clutched a wooden horse. The elder asked if they would return before dawn. One of the hooded men said yes. Martín claims he trailed them as they descended into the crypt beneath San Salvador Abbey. There, in flickering torchlight, he glimpsed a narrow passage hidden behind a carved altar, the same passage rediscovered centuries later during archaeological digs. They led them through the stone gate. I heard the river below. Then the chanting began. The page doesn't describe what he saw next, only that he fled, before the shadow touched me. The aftermath. Martín writes nothing further for nearly a month. When the diary resumes, his tone is frantic, disjointed. The bells did not toll. The king's men burned the prince's bedding. Their books. Their shoes. We are forbidden to speak their names. I asked Sebastian what became of them. He said only, better to forget. Later still, Martin hints at a deeper terror. I see them sometimes. In the garden. Near the orchard wall. They do not speak, but they watch. Was this guilt shaping visions? Trauma bending memory? Or something stranger? Historians still debate it. Why hide the diary? If Martin truly witnessed the princes being led into the abbey tunnels, why didn't he speak? One answer lies at the end of the diary. In his final entry, Martin writes, I should burn these pages. But part of me hopes someone will read them when it is safe to remember. If you find this, forgive me, I was only a boy. The Quinones family, longtime rivals of the crown, apparently kept the diary hidden for generations, perhaps as leverage against Asturias' royal line, or perhaps out of genuine fear. When the diary resurfaced in the 15th century, it was quietly archived. Only fragments circulated among scholars until the late 19th century, when the manuscript was studied in full for the first time. Historians still argue. Skeptics dismiss Martin's account as a blend of rumor and invention. Supporters point to his precise descriptions of architectural features, passages beneath the abbey, symbols carved into the crypt walls, that were unknown until rediscovered centuries later. And then there's the fragment Martin mentions, a wooden toy horse Rodrigo carried into the tunnels that night. Remember what workers uncovered in 1823, beneath the prince's chambers in the palace? A decayed, headless wooden horse, hidden in a forgotten shaft. Coincidence? Or confirmation? The most haunting line, near the diary's midpoint, scrawled in ink so faint it was nearly missed, are 4 words Martin underlined twice. We were not afraid. The same phrase was carved into the underside of the rotted toy horse centuries later. Separated by hundreds of years, 2 artifacts whisper the same message. Whether Martin's diary is confession, witness statement, or elaborate forgery, one thing is undeniable. It ties nearly every loose thread together: the abbey tunnels, the sealed crypts, the erased records, the forbidden letters, the medallions. And yet, like everything in this story, just when we think we're close to truth, it slips like water through our fingers. Because Martin never tells us what happened once the chanting began. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he couldn't bear to write it. Or maybe someone made sure he wouldn't. The ruins of the old monastery sit quiet beneath a sky bruised with twilight. The Nalon River winding silver beneath the shadowed hills. Centuries have passed, yet the air here still feels heavy, as though time itself slows in reverence or fear. This is where it began, and perhaps where it ended. Archaeologists return here again and again, drawn by the same unanswered questions. Beneath these broken cloisters lie the sealed abbey tunnels Martin de Ursula described in his diary. Beneath these stones runs the subterranean river whispered about in the Codex of Covadonga. And somewhere, hidden deeper still, may lie the final traces of Fernando and Rodrigo. In 2003, researchers armed with ground-penetrating radar mapped sections of the monastery grounds previously inaccessible. What they found reignited the mystery. Beneath the eastern courtyard, they detected a void, a chamber approximately 20 feet across, flooded with cold water. No records of its construction exist, and no safe way down has yet been discovered. But divers who explored the riverbank nearby reported something strange. 40 meters downstream, at a point where the underground current resurfaces briefly into open air, they found carved initials on the limestone wall. The letters are faint, nearly worn away, but most agree they read, Fr. Fernando and Rodrigo. Or perhaps coincidence. Perhaps. Even stranger is what lies just above those initials. A crude carving of 2 faceless figures holding hands beneath a crescent moon. Identical symbols were discovered years earlier beneath Oviedo Cathedral, etched faintly into the stone near the hidden coffers containing the 2 child-sized skeletons. How could carvings separated by miles match so perfectly, unless they were made by the same hand, or left as a kind of mark? A breadcrumb trail for those who dared to follow. Theories multiply endlessly. Were the princes drowned in the subterranean river to erase their lineage forever? Were they smuggled to safety, their fates hidden under threat of death? Or were they bound into some ritualistic silence, losing their names? As the Codex warned, to preserve the stability of the crown? Each theory has evidence, each theory has holes. And so, 6 centuries later, Asturias remains caught between shadow and story. Today, if you stand in the ruined cloister at dusk, locals say you can sometimes hear it, a faint murmur beneath the ground. Water rushing where no surface river flows. On rare nights, some claim to hear laughter carried on the mist, light, fleeting, and impossibly young. Most dismiss it as folklore. But not everyone. One of the restoration workers at the site, a man who refuses to give his name, swears he saw 2 barefoot boys standing on the far bank of the river one fog-drenched morning. He blinked, and they were gone. And maybe that's how this mystery survives, not in bones or letters or forbidden archives, but in the persistence of memory itself. Because even when names are erased, whispers endure, somewhere, in a chamber still sealed beneath stone and shadow. Perhaps the last fragments of the prince's story wait for us. Or perhaps we were never meant to find them. As Martin wrote in his diary over 600 years ago. Better to forget, but Asturias hasn't, neither have we. And so, we leave the princes here, in the hush between history and legend, where truth dissolves into whispers and memory seeps into myth. The monastery walls crumble a little more each year. Yet the shadows they cast somehow deepen, as though holding on to secrets time refuses to swallow. Perhaps the answers lie buried beneath cathedral stones, or sealed in archives too fragile or too dangerous to open. Perhaps they drift silently along the subterranean river, carried forever out of reach. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. 2 boys disappeared into a night so deep it swallowed their names, their laughter, their lineage, and left us only with echoes. But listen closely, and those echoes still speak. They speak in carved initials beneath limestone ledges, in medallions hidden beneath rotted cloth, in letters that insist, they're beneath us still. They speak in the quiet dread of historians who fear that uncovering too much might change everything we think we know. And maybe that's why we can't let this mystery go. Because the princes of Asturias are more than a story. They're a reminder of how power bends memory. How silence can be as deliberate as violence. And how, sometimes, the greatest secrets are the ones we're told not to seek. So breathe a little slower. Let the unanswered questions rest beside you for tonight. Because whether Fernando and Rodrigo lie beneath cathedral stones, wander Covadonga's mists, or were never here at all, Asturias remembers. And somewhere, beneath shadow and river, maybe they do too.